Welcome to this journey through one of the most profoundly silencing winters ever to descend upon the Ozark settlements. In the years when church bells marked the rhythms of community life, when their sound carried across valleys to remind scattered homesteads that they belonged to something larger than their individual isolation, when the weekly call to worship and the tolling for births and deaths and emergencies provided the audible thread that held frontier people together, there came a winter when the snow accumulated so deeply that it buried the church itself, muffled the bell tower until its sound could no longer be heard, and left the community to discover what happened when the voice that had always connected them fell silent beneath accumulation that transformed their landmark into a white mound indistinguishable from the drifts surrounding it. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the silence that descended when snow took not just travel and contact, but the sound that had always marked time and connection. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we stand in that silent valley and listen for a bell that will not ring, consider what church bells meant on the frontier and why their sound was understood to be more than merely religious signal, but essential infrastructure that made community possible across distances that would otherwise isolate families completely. The bell at the center of a settlement marked time, called people to gather, announced emergencies, and provided a point of audible reference that reminded everyone within hearing distance that they were not alone, that other families existed nearby, that the settlement continued to function even when snow or weather made travel impossible and visual confirmation of neighbors unavailable. A church bell could be heard for miles under normal conditions. Its sound, carried across valleys, penetrated forests, reached homesteads that were too distant to see the settlement, but that could hear its voice and could orient themselves by its calls. The weekly Sunday ringing told families when services would begin, allowing them to synchronize their travel and their gathering even when clocks were unreliable or absent. The tolling for deaths provided news that might otherwise take days or weeks to travel between scattered homes. The emergency ringing, rapid, uncontrolled pulls that created frantic, irregular sound, warned of fire or danger or urgent need for help, summoning whoever could respond to provide assistance, or at least to learn what crisis had occurred. The silencing of such a bell was not merely the loss of a sound, but the severing of the primary connection that held a community together across distances. The removal of the voice that had always said, "We are here, you are not alone, time continues, life persists." When snow accumulated deeply, enough to muffle or completely silence a church bell, it created an isolation that was more profound than physical impossibility of travel. It created a silence where sound should have been, an absence where presence had always existed, a void where reassurance had always echoed, leaving families to realize that the snow had not just blocked roads, but had taken the voice that made community audible, and that without that voice, each homestead became an island surrounded by white silence that contained no evidence that anyone else had survived, or that the world beyond the snow still existed. The winter of 1866-1867 brought snow to the Ozarks that accumulated beyond any depth the region had experienced in living memory, and the settlement at Cedar Creek, consisting of perhaps 40 families scattered across 10 square miles of valley and ridges, centered on a small church with a bell tower that rose 30 feet above the ground, discovered what happened when accumulation reached levels that buried not just cabins and barns, but the tallest structures that had always remained visible above winter snow, that had always provided vertical landmarks in landscape flattened by white, and that had always maintained their function of calling and warning and connecting, regardless of how deep the drifts might grow. The Cedar Creek Church had been built in 1854, constructed by community effort on a small rise near the center of the settlement, positioned to be accessible to families in all directions and to maximize the distance the bell's sound would carry. The building itself was modest, a single room with rough-hewn pews, a small altar, windows that provided light but no adornment. But the bell tower was substantial, rising 30 feet above the roofline and housing a bell that weighed perhaps 200 pounds, cast in St. Louis and transported to Cedar Creek at considerable expense, because the community understood that the bell was not luxury, but necessity, not decoration but infrastructure that made their scattered settlement function as a community rather than as a collection of isolated homesteads. The bell rang every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, calling families to services that began at 10. It rang for weddings, for funerals, for Christmas and Easter celebrations. It tolled slowly and solemnly when someone in the community died, the number of strikes indicating whether the deceased was man, woman, or child. And it could be rung in emergency. Anyone who reached the church and needed to summon help could pull the rope and create the frantic ringing that would bring whoever could respond to investigate and assist. For 12 years, from 1854 to 1866, the bell had functioned as intended. Its voice had become part of the audible landscape, its weekly call as reliable as sunrise, its sound carrying across valleys to reach homesteads 5 or 6 miles distant, providing them with connection and reassurance and the knowledge that the settlement continued and that they remained part of it even when winter made travel impossible and physical gathering unlikely for weeks at a time. The winter of 1866-1867 began with snow in mid-November, earlier than usual, but not remarkably so. The first accumulation was modest, perhaps 8 inches, and the community adapted with the routines that were familiar from previous winters. The bell rang on Sunday, November 18th, calling families to services that a dozen people managed to attend despite the snow and the cold. The following Sunday, November 25th, additional snow had fallen, but the bell rang again, its sound carrying clearly across landscape that was white, but not yet deeply buried. December brought heavier snow. Accumulations that had measured in inches began measuring in feet. By mid-December, the settlement had perhaps 3 feet of snow on level ground, with drifts significantly deeper where wind had piled accumulation against obstacles. The church building itself was still clearly visible. Its walls and roof rose well above the snow, and the bell tower remained prominent as the tallest structure in the settlement, its height ensuring that the bell would remain functional even when ground-level buildings were partially buried. The bell rang on December 16th for Sunday services. Only a handful of families managed to make the journey through the deep snow, but those who came reported that the bell's sound had seemed muffled, as if the accumulation of snow on the ground and on surrounding structures was absorbing sound that had previously carried cleanly across open landscape. The effect was noticeable, but not alarming. The bell could still be heard, still functioned to call people to gather, and the muffling was understood as a normal consequence of snow's sound-absorbing properties. But on December 23rd, when the bell should have rung for the Christmas Eve service, its sound was barely audible beyond a few hundred yards from the church. Families who lived a mile or two distant, families who had always been able to hear the Sunday bell clearly, heard nothing or heard only a faint, muted tone that was so quiet they were not certain whether they were hearing the bell or imagining it. Several families who had planned to attend Christmas services based on the bell's call failed to appear because they never heard the signal, arriving on Christmas Day to find services already concluded and to learn that the bell had rung, but that its voice had been so reduced by the snow that it had failed to carry beyond the immediate vicinity of the church. The minister, Reverend Samuel Thornton, examined the bell tower on December the 26th to understand why the sound had been so diminished. He found that snow had accumulated on the roof of the tower to a depth that partially blocked the openings through which the bell's sound had always projected outward. The accumulation on the ground around the church had also risen to a level where it nearly reached the bottom of the bell tower openings, creating a situation where the bell was ringing in a space that was increasingly enclosed by snow above and snow below, with only narrow gaps remaining for sound to escape. Reverend Thornton cleared what snow he could from the tower roof, shoveling away the accumulation that had blocked the openings and hoping that this would restore the bell's normal carrying distance. But the effort was temporary. The snow continued to fall through late December and into January, and the accumulation he had removed was replaced within days by new snow that filled the openings and that rose higher on the ground around the church, further enclosing the space from which the bell's sound needed to project. By early January, the snow depth at Cedar Creek had reached approximately 5 feet on level ground, with drifts around the church rising to 8 or 10 feet, because the building created an obstacle that caused wind-driven snow to pile against its walls and around its foundation. The church building itself remained visible, its roof and walls still rose above the surrounding snow. But the bell tower was now surrounded by accumulation that reached nearly to the top of the tower's openings, creating a situation where the bell was ringing in a space that was almost completely enclosed by snow. The bell rang on Sunday, January 6, 1867, for the first service of the new year. The sound was barely audible to families who lived within half a mile of the church. Those who lived farther distant heard nothing. The bell had not failed mechanically, still swung when pulled, still struck its clapper against its bronze body, still produced sound. But the sound it produced was trapped within the enclosure that the snow had created, muffled by the accumulation above and around it, absorbed by the white material that now surrounded the tower on all sides except for small gaps that remained open at the very top of the tower openings. Through January, as the snow continued to accumulate, and as the community struggled with isolation and hardship that the extreme accumulation created, the bell's voice continued to diminish. Sunday services were attended by only those who lived close enough to the church to reach it on foot through the deep snow, and even those families could barely hear the bell's call before arriving at the church and seeing for themselves that services were occurring. Families who lived farther away had no way of knowing whether services were being held, whether the bell was ringing, whether the community was still gathering, because the sound that should have carried to them was being absorbed by snow before it could travel beyond the immediate vicinity of the church. By late January, the accumulation around Cedar Creek had reached depths of 6 to 7 feet on level ground. The drifts around the church had risen to 12 or 15 feet, creating mounds of snow that reached the roofline of the church building and that nearly buried the bell tower. The openings through which the bell's sound had always projected were now completely blocked by snow. The accumulation had risen above them, had filled them, had created a continuous white surface that extended from ground to roofline, and that left no gaps through which sound could escape. On Sunday, February 3rd, when Reverend Thornton pulled the bell rope to call the community to worship, the sound that resulted was so muffled that it could not be heard even by people standing 100 feet from the church. The bell was ringing. Thornton could feel the rope moving, could sense the bell swinging in the tower above him, but the sound it created was trapped within the snow-enclosed space, absorbed by the white material surrounding it, reduced to a vibration that could barely be detected even inside the church building. The bell had been silenced, not broken, not removed, not prevented from functioning mechanically, but silenced by the accumulation of snow that had risen high enough and deep enough to completely enclose the space from which its sound needed to project. The tallest structure in the settlement, the landmark that had always remained visible above winter snow, the bell tower that had always maintained its function regardless of accumulation, had been buried deeply enough that its voice could no longer be heard beyond the walls that surrounded it. This silencing created a profound change in the experience of winter isolation for the Cedar Creek community. Families who had always been able to hear the Sunday bell, who had oriented their weeks around its call, who had known that services were being held and that the community continued to function even when they could not attend, now heard only silence. The sound that had always provided evidence of continuing life beyond their own homesteads, that had always reminded them that they were part of something larger than their individual survival, was gone. The psychological impact was significant. Isolation that had previously included the audible connection of the bell became total isolation. No sound carried between homesteads except wind and the occasional crack of ice. No evidence reached distant families that the settlement still existed, or that neighbors had survived the accumulation. No call reminded them that time continued and that gathering would eventually resume when the snow allowed. Each family became an island surrounded by silence, dependent entirely on their own resources and their own judgment about when to attempt travel, to verify that the community still existed beyond the white silence that contained no information and no reassurance. Several families did attempt to reach the church through February and early March, making the difficult journey through 6 or 7 feet of snow, to verify that services were still being held and that the community had not dissolved under the weight of winter's severity. They found the church partially buried, its roof barely visible above the surrounding drifts, its bell tower completely enclosed by snow that had risen to the roof line and that had filled the tower openings so completely that the bell inside might as well have been buried underground for all the sound it could project. Reverend Thornton continued to hold services for the few families who managed to reach the church, but the gatherings were small and somber, marked by the absence of the bell's call and by the knowledge that most of the community had no way of knowing that services were occurring. The bell that had always announced worship, that had always called people together, that had always marked the community's continuation through hardship, was silent beneath snow that refused to melt, and that showed no signs of releasing its grip on the tower that housed the bell or on the landscape that had always carried its sound. The snow continued through February and into early March. By mid-March, accumulation had reached its maximum, estimated at 7 to 8 feet on level ground in the settlement, with drifts around the church reaching 15 to 20 feet. The church building was buried to its roof line, visible only as a slight rise in the white surface, identifiable as a structure only because people knew where it should be, and because the bell tower, still protruding slightly above the highest drifts, provided a landmark that confirmed the church's location. Spring finally began to assert itself in late March. Temperatures rose above freezing during the day. Snow began to melt in earnest, and the accumulation that had seemed permanent throughout winter began to reduce noticeably day by day. By early April, the drifts around the church had melted enough that the bell tower openings were beginning to emerge from the snow, the white material that had filled them and enclosed them settling and melting and draining away, to reveal the gaps through which sound should be able to escape. On Sunday, April 7, 1867, when Reverend Thornton pulled the bell rope, the sound that emerged from the tower was weak and muffled, but audible. The bell rang with something approaching its normal voice, sound projecting outward through openings that were no longer blocked by snow, carrying across landscape that was still partially white, but that no longer contained the deep accumulation that had absorbed sound for the previous 3 months. Families who had not heard the bell since January heard it again in April. The sound reached homesteads a mile or two distant, traveled across valleys that were beginning to show bare ground, reminded people who had spent months in silence that the community still existed, and that gathering was again possible. The response was significant. The first Sunday after the bell could be heard again brought more families to services than had attended at any time since November. People traveling through mud and slush and remaining snow to verify that the settlement had survived, that neighbors had endured, that the community continued despite the winter's attempt to silence and isolate and separate them. But the winter of 1866-1867 left marks that extended beyond the physical damage to structures and the temporary isolation it had created. The silencing of the bell, the removal of the audible connection that had always held the community together across distance, had demonstrated how fragile that connection was, how dependent community was on infrastructure that winter could disable or destroy, and how quickly isolation could become total when the voice that provided reassurance and orientation and connection was taken away. Several families chose not to return to Cedar Creek after the winter of 1866-1867, relocating to settlements that were more compact, where homes were closer together and where winter isolation would be less complete, even if snow accumulated deeply. The population of Cedar Creek never fully recovered to its pre-winter level. The community that had consisted of 40 families in 1866 had been reduced to 30 families by 1868, with the difference representing those who had decided that the risk of such profound isolation was unacceptable, and that the memory of months without hearing the bell, without knowing whether neighbors survived, without any audible evidence that life continued beyond their own walls, was too disturbing to endure again. The church itself survived, requiring repairs to roof and walls that had been damaged by the weight of snow and by the freeze-thaw cycles that had occurred as winter ended. The bell remained functional, continued to ring for Sunday services and for community events, and retained its role as the voice that connected families across the settlement. But those who had lived through the winter, when the bell fell silent, carried the memory of that silence, the knowledge that the sound they depended upon could be taken away by conditions that buried it, as thoroughly as if it had been removed or destroyed, and the recognition that the infrastructure that made community possible was more vulnerable than they had realized. The winter of 1866-1867 was documented in letters and in church records as one of the most severe ever experienced in the Ozarks region. Snow accumulations of 7 to 8 feet on level ground exceeded anything that older settlers could remember from their lifetimes or from the stories they had heard from previous generations. The specific detail of the church bell being silenced by snow accumulation that buried the tower openings was noted in multiple sources, described by people who had experienced the months of silence and who had felt the isolation intensify when the sound that had always provided connection was removed. Modern meteorological analysis suggests that the winter of 1866-1867 was influenced by larger climate patterns that created conditions favorable for sustained cold and heavy precipitation across the central United States. But such analysis does not fully capture the human experience of living through months when accumulation exceeded the height of structures that had always remained visible, when the bell that had always been heard fell silent beneath snow that rose high enough to trap its voice, and when families discovered that the sound they had taken for granted as permanent and reliable could be removed as thoroughly as if it had never existed. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozarks' most profoundly silencing winters, a season when snow accumulated deeply enough to bury the church bell tower, to muffle the sound that had always connected families across distance, and to create an isolation that was not just physical, but audible. Not just the inability to travel, but the inability to hear any evidence that community persisted beyond each family's walls, leaving scattered homesteads to endure months surrounded by silence, where sound should have been, by absence where presence had always existed, by void where reassurance had always echoed. No one heard the bell after the snow covered the church stands as a reminder that the infrastructure that holds communities together is more fragile than we assume, that the connections we depend upon can be severed by conditions that bury them beneath accumulation. We cannot prevent or remove, and that the voice that says, "You are not alone, we are here, life continues," can be taken away by winter that rises high enough to trap it, leaving each family to discover what isolation truly means when not just travel, but sound itself is blocked by white material that absorbs every call and every connection and every reminder that the world contains anything beyond what can be seen from windows, that show only white extending to horizons that contain no movement and no evidence that anyone else has survived, or that the silence will ever end. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where snow silenced not just movement, but sound itself, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between connection and isolation, between the voices that bind communities and the silence that separates them. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what it would mean to lose the sounds that orient your days, on how long you could endure without audible evidence that others exist nearby, on what the silencing of a church bell represents about winter's power, not just to block travel, but to remove the infrastructure that makes community possible across distance. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the sounds you depend upon and what their absence would mean, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate stories that remind us that the connections between us are more vulnerable than we realize, that winter can take not just our ability to reach each other, but our ability to hear each other, and that somewhere in the Ozarks there was once a winter when snow rose high enough to bury a bell tower, to trap its voice beneath white accumulation that absorbed every ring and every call, leaving families to endure months of silence where sound should have been, discovering that isolation is not just distance, but the absence of the audible thread that had always reminded them they belonged to something larger than their own survival, that others existed nearby, and that the bell would ring again when spring came, except that spring was months away, and the silence was immediate and complete and more profound than any silence they had experienced before, because it was silence where sound had always been, absence where presence had always existed, void where reassurance had always echoed across valleys that now contained nothing but white and cold, and the knowledge that the voice that had always connected them had been buried as thoroughly as if it had never existed.